I never thought pouring concrete under my own house would ignite a full-blown war with the HOA. At 68, I figured I had seen enough battles in my life. But nothing prepared me for neighbors marching with clipboards, letters stamped with threats, and meetings where they practically shouted me down. All because I dared to build a garage under my own home. They thought they had me cornered. What they didn't realize was that I had spent 40 years engineering homes stronger than their egos. My name's Frank Lawson. I'm a retired structural engineer, a widower, a father of 2, and a grandfather of 3. After 40 years in construction and inspections, I wanted nothing more than a quiet retirement in my suburban neighborhood. I bought my house 35 years ago with my late wife, Margaret. She used to call it our forever home. It's nothing flashy, just a brick ranch with a wide yard and maple trees shading the driveway. But to me, it's a castle full of memories. When Margaret passed away 5 years ago, the house felt emptier. Her old Chevy pickup, the one we used for road trips and camping, sat under a tarp in the driveway. Every time I walked past it, I heard her laugh, remembered the smell of coffee in thermoses, and the country music she sang off-key. That truck was her soul on 4 wheels, and I couldn't bring myself to part with it. But leaving it exposed to the weather was tearing me apart. The tarp sagged with rain, flapped in storms, and birds seemed to aim for it like a target. That's when the idea struck, why not build a garage underneath the house? I had the technical knowledge, the tools, and enough retirement savings. More importantly, it would keep Margaret's Chevy safe, preserved like the memories it carried. Now, a sensible HOA would have seen this as harmless. It wasn't like I was slapping neon paint on the house or turning my lawn into a junkyard. But ours was different. Our HOA board lived for control. You'd think they were running the Pentagon instead of a community of 120 homes. Their president, Harold Green, was a man with more pride than sense. Picture a 60-something with a beer belly stuffed into polos 2 sizes too small, walking around with a clipboard like he owned the block. The moment I filed the permit with the county and broke ground under the back section of my home, the vultures descended. On the 3rd morning, while I was measuring out the reinforcing bars, Harold marched up my driveway, huffing like he'd run a marathon. "Frank," he barked, "you can't just dig under your house without HOA approval." I wiped my hands on my jeans and leaned on the shovel. "Harold, I've got county permits. It's under my property line. And I'm not changing the exterior. It's perfectly safe." His face turned beet red. "Safe or not, you know the rules. Major alterations need HOA review." "Major alteration?" I raised an eyebrow. "It's a basement extension. Structurally sound. You want me to submit blueprints, I'll send them, but the city has already approved them." That didn't sit well with him. He muttered something about bylaws and stormed off. I thought maybe he'd cool down once he realized the HOA had no jurisdiction over what the county already approved. But oh, was I wrong. 2 days later, I got the first letter. It was printed on thick paper with the HOA logo at the top, bolded words in the center, "Cease construction immediately." I laughed at first. After years of dealing with contractors and building inspectors, this felt like amateur hour. But when I went to the mailbox the next morning, I found another notice, "Violation fee, $200. That's when I knew they weren't bluffing. The violations kept coming. Unapproved structural changes, $500 fine. Noise disturbance, $150 fine. Unauthorized equipment on property, $100 fine. Every day, I felt like they were inventing new rules out of thin air. Neighbors started whispering, too. Some supported me, saying it was my property and Harold had no business interfering. Others frowned as if I was disturbing their peaceful retirement by daring to pick up a hammer. I tried reasoning. I went to the monthly HOA meeting, blueprints in hand, wearing my best button-down shirt to show I wasn't there for a fight. The room was packed, residents sitting in folding chairs, the board lined up behind a long table like judges. When Harold called my name, I stepped forward. Ladies and gentlemen, I understand your concerns. But I've worked in construction for decades. This garage is reinforced properly, approved by the county, and it won't change the neighborhood's look. I'm simply adding protection for my late wife's truck. For a moment, I saw some neighbors soften. But Harold slammed his gavel. You are out of order, Frank. The HOA must maintain harmony and uniformity. Your so-called basement garage is disruptive. Voices erupted in the room. One elderly woman shouted, "He's right. It's his house." Another man countered, "If we let him do it, what's next? Underground pools? Nightclubs?" I stood there, heart pounding, realizing this wasn't about rules. It was about power. Harold couldn't stand that someone bypassed his little kingdom by going straight to the county. The board voted that night, construction must stop. I didn't stop. The next morning, I poured the concrete slab, whistling while Harold stood across the street glaring. By afternoon, I had an official sheriff's deputy at my door delivering a final warning letter from the HOA. I thanked the deputy, closed the door, and sat at my kitchen table staring at the pile of notices. Rage boiled in me. For 40 years I followed codes, built safe homes for families, and now a bunch of clipboard cowboys wanted to tell me I didn't know what I was doing on my own property? But anger wasn't going to win this war. Logic would. I pulled out the HOA bylaws that night, pages of legalese most residents never bothered to read. As I combed through, I noticed something. The section about structural modifications specifically mentioned exterior changes visible from the street. Nothing about underground or interior extensions. My pulse quickened. They'd overstepped. The next morning, I walked outside to find Harold waiting on the sidewalk with 2 board members. He smirked, thinking he'd cornered me. "Frank," he said, waving another paper, "we're escalating this to liens on your property." I looked him dead in the eye. "Harold, before you do that, you might want to reread your own bylaws. Because according to Section 8, Subsection 4, interior and underground modifications aren't under your jurisdiction. Which means," I tapped the paper in his hand, "every fine you've sent me is invalid." The smirk faltered. For the first time, Harold looked uncertain. But I wasn't done. I leaned closer and whispered so only he could hear, "And if you keep harassing me, Harold, I'll take this stack of letters straight to a lawyer. Imagine explaining to the county judge why your HOA thinks it outranks city permits." The color drained from his face. Of course, Harold wasn't about to surrender so easily. That night, as I cleaned up my tools, I saw him knocking on neighbors' doors, spreading rumors about sinkholes and collapsed foundations. He wanted fear on his side. By the end of the week, half the neighborhood believed my garage was going to bring their houses down. And that's when things got ugly. Rumors spread faster than wildfire in a tight-knit neighborhood. By the next HOA meeting, half the community believed I was building a cave that would collapse and swallow their homes whole. People eyed me with suspicion when I walked down the street, as if I were drilling a mine shaft instead of a garage. Harold thrived on it. He stood at the front of the meeting room with a projector screen, showing diagrams of potential structural failures that looked like they'd been copied off the internet. Words like sinkhole, erosion, and liability filled the slides. "This," Harold announced, jabbing at the screen with a pointer, "is what could happen if Mr. Lawson continues his reckless project." I raised my hand. "With all due respect, Harold, those slides aren't based on my project. They're generic images." Here, I unrolled my own blueprints, detailed to the last measurement, stamped with county approval. "This is the actual plan. Reinforced walls, proper drainage, soil testing, all by the book." The room buzzed with murmurs. Some neighbors nodded, impressed. But others muttered about safety. Fear had already planted its roots. Then came the kicker. Harold pulled out a letter. "Ladies and gentlemen, our HOA has decided that if Mr. Lawson does not stop, we will place a lien on his property for unpaid violation fines. That means foreclosure proceedings could follow." Gasps filled the room. I felt a chill run down my spine. They weren't just trying to stop my garage, they were trying to take my home. I went home that night more furious than I'd been in years. Margaret and I built our life in this house. The thought of losing it because of Harold's ego lit a fire in me I didn't know I still had at 68. So I did what any engineer worth his salt would do. I gathered evidence. The next week, I requested county inspection records for every property in the HOA. What I found made me laugh out loud. 3 board members, including Harold, had done unauthorized additions years ago, deck extensions, a sunroom, even an outdoor shed, all without HOA approval. Not only that, but one of them had failed inspection twice before quietly bribing a contractor to sign off on the paperwork. I photocopied everything and kept it in a neat folder labeled HOA Hypocrisy. The very next meeting, I carried that folder under my arm like a weapon. The board sat smugly at their table, ready to crucify me. Harold began the meeting with his usual pomp. "This session will address the ongoing violation of..." I stood up and cut him off. "Before you go any further, I think everyone here deserves to see some documents I've collected." Gasps and whispers spread as I handed copies around the room. "While you've all been told I'm breaking rules, your board members have been happily ignoring the very bylaws they enforce. Deck expansions, unapproved sheds, failed inspections, all swept under the rug." Harold turned beet red. "This is irrelevant. We are discussing your violations." I slammed the folder shut. "My so-called violations don't even exist. Your own bylaws only cover exterior, visible alterations. My garage is underground, invisible from the street, and fully permitted by the county. Every fine you've issued me is illegal harassment. And if you keep pushing liens, I'll bring these documents in a lawsuit straight to the county court. How do you think a judge will react when he sees this hypocrisy?" The room erupted. Some neighbors laughed. Others shouted. One man in the back called out, "So Harold, it's fine when you add a sunroom without approval, but Frank can't build underground? For once, Harold didn't have a comeback. He sat in his chair, sweating bullets, his confidence crumbling like wet concrete. But he wasn't finished yet. A week later, I got a knock on my door. It was a county inspector, clipboard in hand. Harold had reported me for unsafe excavation. I invited the inspector in, showed him every blueprint, every reinforcement, every permit. He measured, checked, and even complimented the workmanship. When he left, he shook my hand. "Mr. Lawson, you're more compliant than half the contractors I inspect. You're clear." The next day, the inspector filed his official report, "No violations found." That was the nail in Harold's coffin. The HOA could no longer fine me, threaten liens, or spread lies. In fact, the county report publicly embarrassed them. Neighbors began approaching me, some apologizing for believing the rumors, others thanking me for standing up to Harold. And then something unexpected happened. Several residents demanded a vote to remove Harold as HOA president. Within a month, he was gone, replaced by a more reasonable neighbor who promised to focus on community events instead of personal vendettas. When the dust settled, I finally finished the garage. It was a crisp autumn morning when I drove Margaret's old Chevy down the ramp and into its new home. The garage smelled of fresh concrete and motor oil, but to me it smelled like peace. I parked the truck, turned off the engine, and sat there for a long while, running my hand over the steering wheel. I could almost hear Margaret humming beside me, telling me I'd done the right thing. As I turned off the lights and closed the garage door, I felt a wave of triumph. This wasn't just about winning against Harold or an HOA. It was about protecting what mattered, my memories, my dignity, and my right to enjoy the home Margaret and I built together. Neighbors still stop by sometimes, asking to see the infamous basement garage. I show them proudly, and most smile, admitting it's sturdier and safer than they ever expected. A few even ask if I'd help design something similar for them. I tell them the same thing every time: it's not about concrete and steel. It's about standing your ground when someone tries to take away what's yours. And as I look at Margaret's truck parked safely inside, I know one thing for sure: the HOA thought they could bury me under paperwork and threats. But in the end, I buried them with their own hypocrisy. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more shocking HOA battles, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps these real stories coming, and you won't want to miss what's next.